Hi, this is Jane. Welcome to Getting Started in Slay. The topic of this particular discussion is what is a bottom line and what is sobriety in a trauma-based addiction. I'm going to start off with basically bottom lines or acting out behavior are what you came here to stop doing. Everybody ended up here because there was something they wanted to not do anymore, but they can't seem to stop alone. Sobriety is refraining from whatever that is you don't want to do anymore, but you can't stop doing. We're going to talk about the difference between how do you understand a trauma-based addiction as opposed to a substance-based addiction. Slay is a trauma or behavior-based addiction where you're not addicted to an external substance, but you're addicted to a pattern of behavior that creates a high similar to addictions that involve an external chemical like drugs, alcohol, or food. We're going to talk about the three major categories of acting out or bottom lines. We're going to talk about some ways to determine what those are for you individually. And those are the three things that we're going to cover, and then people are going to come in and give their perspective on how that worked out for them. Well, the first thing that makes understanding what is sobriety and what is quote-unquote acting out in a trauma-based addiction is because it is a pattern of behavior instead of a substance. Alcohol, you either took a drink or you didn't. You either took a hit or you didn't. You either ate potato chips or you didn't. What that is quite clear. In Slay, usually it's a pattern of behavior that grows out of a traumatic past. It's hard to see for two reasons. One is the addiction in and of itself. All addictions, they justify themselves. They make it seem like you have to do it. And so it's hard to see it as a separate pattern of behavior than just life. Also, what's really difficult for Slay is every single quote-unquote acting out behavior, it exists in a healthy form, right? Love, sex, fantasy, obsession, all these things, relationships, they all exist in a healthy form. So how can you tell if it's an addiction or if it's just being a person? Probably the secondly difficult reasons why it's hard to see it as an addiction is because it usually is an addiction that grows out of a disruption in relationships and safety that disrupt the developmental stages as a person grows up. And those developmental stages, they're meant to shape how a person sees life, how a person sees love, how a person sees safety, identity, goals, usefulness. If those things are shaped by a traumatic past, it doesn't look like anything unusual. It looks like the way it has to be. It looks like the way love is. It looks like the way you behave in relationships. There's a disruption of any assessment that it is separate from life. Usually a trauma-based addiction, it's a pattern of behaviors, and they're based on two things. One, how did we get our needs met in a dysfunctional or traumatic environment? We may have had to do things or not do things to get our needs met that nobody should really have had to do. And yet we keep trying to get our needs met in the here and now using that pattern. The second thing is they're based on how did we protect ourselves growing up. So we keep trying to protect ourselves now in the ways we needed to protect ourselves back then, and we needed to do it back then, but it's getting us in trouble now. I think one of the things that's really hard to understand is how can a pattern of behavior be intoxicating? And yet, as anyone who's here, it has all the same earmarks. I'm going to keep comparing it to alcoholism or drug addiction. It has, instead of a substance from outside that you take in and have that alter your body chemistry or your brain chemistry, the action creates an internal response where it's your own brain chemistry. It's your own body chemistry that alters. The behavior uploads the chemical reaction in the brain and the body. What a lot of people don't realize is, like even a drug people consider cocaine, people don't get high on cocaine. Cocaine, the reason I say this is because it's a little slide into slay. What cocaine does is it interferes with the reuptake of the brain's own chemicals. So it makes it so you overload on your own brain chemicals. Cocaine doesn't make you high. It makes it so you get high on your own brain chemistry. And that's the same exact thing that happens with behaviors. They create a certain kind of chemical response that is just exactly like heroin or cocaine or alcohol. And it does all the exact same things. There is a mood-altering high. A mood-altering high that alters perception to such a degree that it may even alter our personality, that we would do things under the influence of that don't even fit with our own personality, that don't even fit with our own comfort level, just like somebody would with drugs or alcohol. It's also one of the reasons why actual sobriety and refraining from bottom lines is so important, because that is a real intoxication. It is a real biochemical high. And that biochemical high, it interferes with the kinds of assessment and self-honesty that are required for recovery in a 12-step program. Because that's actually another question. Why do I have to refrain from my bottom lines? I mean, most people come here because they want to stop, but then there may be a list of things that go down that road, and they go, why do I have to give that up? If it is intoxicating and creates the phenomenon of obsession, compulsion, and craving, and intoxication to the degree that it distorts perception, reaction, and behavior, it makes it really hard to participate in the kinds of self-assessment that recovery requires. So I think bottom lines, what are bottom lines in acting out behavior? Sobriety is refraining from that so that you can have the experience of sort of having the withdrawal, the brain chemistry drops, and there's a possibility for clarity, and there's a possibility for self-assessment and self-honesty. Usually there's 3 categories of acting out behavior or bottom lines in SLAY. Usually the first one is a specific person you can't stop seeing or thinking, and that is often called a qualifier. If you're new, that's what somebody means. They feel like they are addicted to a specific person. The second one involves fantasy or fantasy-related behaviors, usually involving some kind of media like the internet. The third one are behaviors involving real people, but the people don't really matter. They're just vehicles for the behavior. People become, in this third category, are almost interchangeable, or they're one in a series of someone who just serves the addiction. So if that gives you some help, those are usually just the 3 categories of the kinds of acting out behavior that are possible. Or you can have any and all of those, or you can have any combination of those. Or the fourth one is what we call anorexia or avoidance. That is where people are, instead of having addictive obsessive compulsions to connect with people in certain ways or to connect in certain ways, they have an addictive obsession a compulsion to disconnect. And that is a significant part of our fellowship as well. So a specific person or qualifier. 2, fantasy-related behaviors involving media. 3, behaviors involving real people, but where the person just serves the behavior. And 4, anorexia or avoidance. Okay, how do I determine what my bottom lines are? We have all bottom lines are self-determined because obviously since it's a pattern of behavior that grows out of an individual pattern of trauma, the addictive system is going to match the traumatic system that person grew up in. So it's going to be very, very individualized. So usually I start with, there's several different ways. You can start with what we call with our readings, which help with identification, where you read about how other people describe their addiction. Probably the 3 best ways, well, actually I'm going to say 4 best ways, readings, is we have our what we call our basic text. And that's where people describe their particular pattern of acting out or bottom lines that brought them to this fellowship. We have also called the Bottom Lines pamphlet, which Scott and Ryan are get us a link to if you want to buy that. We have our basic text, which I think I mentioned that, which everybody will have a link to that. We also have our SLAY 12 and 12 draft literature. We'll have a link to that. And the only requirement is that at some point you might be willing, you don't have to do it, but you just have to be willing to give feedback. And that will describe step 1, which we call being powerless, seeing what we have, what is our addiction. And there's a lot of different ways that's described about how it plays out for other people. And then you can identify with that. The second one is meetings. We have a lot of great meetings. We actually on Monday night, I think it's at 8:25, 8:30 or something. I could be wrong. We have a lines meeting, and we have a meeting. It's every week. That's all they talk about is lines. So you can listen to how other people set their lines and see if you identify and find that helpful. We also on Sunday on the phone meetings, which the number is also on our website. There's an identification, a 15-minute we'll call qualification or identification, where someone describes how the addiction plays out for them. Also, almost at every single meeting, people discuss, we do what's called getting current, which means they describe the challenges that they're experiencing from their addiction, and that'll give you lots of opportunities to listen and see how other people describe it and maybe give you words or a language for how your own addiction plays out. The third one, this is one of my, I actually recommend all 3 of these, is some kind of a step 1 inventory. Because one of the things that's really hard about this addiction is it has a psychological cause, and it has psychological symptoms, but it is in fact a spiritual sickness. And why one person who grows up in trauma doesn't develop an addiction and another person does, nobody knows that any more than we really know now why one person has an addictive reaction to alcohol and one person doesn't. I could take it or leave it. Why one person's response to trauma organized itself into a spiritual sickness that sort of needs a spiritual solution to resolve, I don't know. But my experience is that once it becomes clear that it is an addiction, the spiritual solution of the fellowship and the 12 steps is usually statistically your best bet. So this is a step 1 inventory. Scott put this on there so you can find it. But I'm going to describe it now. I think just because you'll start to see how starting the inventory will help you see, okay, is this just me being a person, or is this really a problematic behavior that I have to stop doing because otherwise I'll just be I'm basically drunk all the time on a reaction to my own behavior. This is how you know something's an addiction or not. One, you just start writing a list. You don't have to feel bad about it. You don't have to change it. In fact, you won't be able to change it. Everything you do that you don't want to do, it'll probably be what brought you here, what brought you to this website. What do I keep doing that I don't want to do? And I recommend that people don't even limit themselves to sex or love, because a lot of things are involved in this addiction that you may not realize. So just write down everything you do that you don't want to do. It may be even eating chocolate chip cookies. I don't know. Just write it down. The second one is, once I write down everything, once I start, I can't stop. For somebody who drinks or any other drug, you pick up, you may want to relax, you pick up a drink, you put it down, you forget about it for the rest of the day or the rest of your life. An alcoholic, once they pick up a drink, now it's harder to stop drinking than it was to stop taking the first one. So that it creates that phenomenon of craving. Once you start, you can't stop. The third one is, like I said, the phenomenon of craving. Then you have to have it. And the fourth one is, and this is really crucial, because some people could describe that about a lot of things, regular love or sexual desire, or how we focus on people we care about. It has to be the persistence of a behavior in the face of known negative consequences, which means you don't have the power of choice, which means you are, in fact, powerless. And those are 5 major areas of consequences. So just first write down everything you do that you don't want to do. No matter how hard you try, you can't stop doing it. Then once you start, you can't stop. Then it's financial, safety, self-esteem, personal and sex relations, and life goals. So does it either cost me money I don't have, money I need to spend on something else, or does it interfere with my ability to make money? Again, you don't have to feel bad about it. You don't have to change it. Just write it down. Yeah. Then the second is safety. Do I endanger my own safety or somebody else's? Do I endanger my health? Am I willing to endanger the health of others related to this behavior? Self-esteem. Does it make me feel bad about myself? Do I do it even though I feel depressed, shamed, despairing, hopeless, empty? Do I keep doing it, maybe even self-hate, even though it makes me feel bad about myself? The fourth one is relationships. Do I keep doing this behavior even though it affects people I love? I'm going to lose somebody I don't want to lose. I hurt somebody I don't want to hurt. My children, my spouse, my partner, my parents, my friends. They're significantly impacted because I can't stop doing this thing. And then the fifth one are goals, ambitions. Are there things I want in my life to be? That I spend all my time focused on this. I'm always distracted by that. There's things I had wanted my life to be, or a person I wanted to be, that is significantly impacted because of this behavior I can't stop doing. And again, you don't have to feel bad about it. Just write them all down. And then you write them all down, and then you grab one of these lovely recovery partners, and you say, you know what, can I read this to you? Because our basic principles, right? Inventory, omission, amends, listening to other people write inventories, listen to their inventories. And what will happen is you'll start to get a picture of your addiction. What is normal human behavior will start to become clearly separated from what are lists of acting out behaviors, also known as bottom lines, that you may need to refrain from in order to not upload the intoxication and the phenomenon of compulsion and craving, so that you can be free in the way that you would like to be free. So I think that's a starting place, and then we're going to have other people come in. They're going to, all the stuff that I forgot, they're going to come in and talk about, or their experience with that, or any newcomers who would like to ask questions and give other people a response. We're basically having an after meeting here, and hopefully people will ask the questions that somebody out there would want to ask. Anyway, with that, I'll pass it back to you, Scott.
Hey, thanks, Jane. I think maybe I might take the first crack at a question or the first crack at a discussion, and I would be really interested to hear from us all here as to, there is what we know after we work the steps is that we are powerless to do anything about our addiction. And one of the things that my sponsor drove into me was that I can't control my addictions. And so sometimes if I am working, having bottom lines or circles or however you want to describe it, that kind of gives me an idea that I can do something about my addiction. And I know that we have to take action. But for me, being a little control freak that I am, big control freak that I am, always am wrestling to take control of everything from God. And so for me, my sponsor, we just defined my sobriety. We sat down and defined my sobriety, and that was the end of the discussion. And so, and I don't know if we want to have a little bit of a discussion. So my sobriety was really very easily defined, and it was anything that I did that was selfish-driven in nature. So anything that was a selfish sexual nature, but I really honestly could almost think that could apply to anything when it's self-will or selfishness. So I don't know. Does anybody have any thoughts on that?
Well, this is Jane. I forgot that I was going to moderate this, so I think that's such a great question. I forgot about that. So I'll just moderate, but would anyone like to come in, press *6 who'd like to respond to that? That's a great question. Well, I'll start, and then you guys can. Did someone else come in?
No, go ahead, Jake. I'll wait.
No, after you.
No, I would need to repeat the question, so I think if you just go, then I'll get the gist of it from that.
Okay, great. Thanks. It is one of the things that is really, really tricky about this addiction, right? Because as Scott mentioned, there's a lot of what I call addiction management. People think that once they identify their bottom lines, their recovery is about learning to manage and not do those things. When obviously if you're powerless, you can't stop by active will alone. We need to work the steps to have God give us the power to remove that from us and relieve that from us. So more than other addictions, it's kind of like, well, okay, here's my starting place, right? Here's some things I came here to stop doing, but I can't by active will stop doing them by myself. But the problem is that since acting out is genuinely intoxicating, it is genuinely mood altering, it is genuinely, it's like once you start, it's a runaway train. So I think it's helpful to have some sense of what, like some little signposts of like, what, I really And people later are able to change that, but these things at this point in time are so intoxicating, so mood altering that that I can't participate in the degree of honesty and faith and surrender that's required for the steps. So do I think people should try to not do stuff that causes them and other people pain? Sure, I do. Do I believe they're powerless? Yeah, I really do. Which is why I try to get people started on the steps right away, so they can get the power to have God remove that. But we do have to have some sense. It's just like in the big book, there's like 2 whole chapters about alcoholism. He describes alcoholism a lot. Even though that's a much simpler thing. You either took a drink or you didn't. So we have to have some kind of guideline, I think, as a starting place, because otherwise certain behaviors will be so intoxicating that we won't be able to participate in the actions of recovery. Anyway, that's my view. And was that you, Jim, that wanted to come?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, please come in.
Yes. Well, thank you. With regard to bottom lines, what I've come to learn, and I'm learning more about this, is that, I'll preface it by saying that I've been attending SLA meetings for 10 years now, and I'm getting more out of my experience rather recently. But when I first started to try to define bottom lines, and as you said, it's something that we want to abstain from or avoid. And one sponsor said to me, it's also good to think of replacing a bottom line or something you want to abstain from. And my initial experience was, in SLA, was the defining the bottom lines based upon the first characteristics of sex and love addiction. And that reads, having few healthy boundaries, we became sexually involved and or emotionally attached to people without knowing them. That was very clear to me, a characteristic that I had to pay attention to, because in my first experience with 12-step was Al-Anon and CODA, and I have this codependent aspect that led me into discovering that the biggest problem I have, and the bottom line, is to get to know someone, especially if I'm considering dating or relationship or partnership, or if I'm noticing some emotional attachment to people without knowing them, whether it's romantic or sexual or not, so that if there is any potential for that, or I see some behavior on my part to indicate I'm being triggered, to use the term, or they are, then I need to acknowledge that, talk to my sponsor and do some step work around that. So one other thing I want to mention is that it was good for me to hear the categories and to hear the distinction between trauma-based addiction and chemical-based addiction. And I won't go into more details or belabor this, but understanding that there is something called trauma-based addiction led me to look into my background more and understand more how I came, to SLAA and the program that I'm in now, because I did learn that regardless of the fact that I had hit bottom and I was drinking at the time, I abruptly stopped, and I find that I am the type of person that doesn't seem to have that distinct craving that's defined and explained in the big book. And I'm learning more that the alcohol was a way to enable the kind of acting out behaviors that I found not acceptable to me or to others. So I just wanted to make those points, and I will be listening again to this recording to understand more about the three categories and the definitions that you provided. Thank you much.
Oh, thank you, Jim, so much. That was wonderful. I really appreciate you coming in. Who'd like to share next, either answering Scott's question or about focusing on sobriety versus focusing on bottom lines? And does coming up with a bottom line give you the indication that maybe you have power where you don't? Just press *6 and come in.
So, Jane, this is Scott again.
Hey, Scott.
Could I jump in just a little bit more and add a little fuel to the fire? Part of the conversation that my sponsor gave me was talking about, I was lucky that my first initial sponsor was an AA sponsor, and so above and beyond getting all those great AA slogans that you get from those guys, he was incredibly rigid, and all the time would talk to me about being a dry drunk, and it would be that I'm not consuming my addiction, but mentally I am, because I am able to, even though, and I guess this goes to speaking about what you're saying, which is defining what sobriety is. But, I was not physically acting out, but in my mind I was still able to act out. And so, and that phenomenon of craving was still existing, because I hadn't separated myself really, and so my sponsor would call that being a dry drunk. And he would ask me if I was a dry drunk on occasion, and I greatly appreciated it. And it kind of reminds me of that, in the characteristics of sex and love addiction that a lot of our meetings read in part of their startup and shutdowns is, one of the things it says is we mistake. Let me see if I can. I'm looking to see if I can. I'll just have to. I thought I could find it real quick, but we mistake being avoidant or avoiding our actions, mistaking them for sobriety, when really what we're doing is we're anorexic, or we're avoiding them. And so my sponsor was always, look, when you're acting out, when something's going on, when you're violating, when you're getting off into that, you need to know that that's you, that's your addict talking to you. He's trying to take care of you. There's something that you're refusing to look at that needs to be addressed. There's something that has to be given to higher power that you're refusing to address. And so your addict now is trying to address it. And, of course, he's really bad because he's only got one plan, which is to act out. I mean, that's always his answer to everything, Out of milk? Well, let's go act out. We're got fired from the job? Well, let's go act out. Had a really great day? Well, let's go act out. And so maybe sometimes we need to allow ourselves the room to make a mistake so that we can learn from it. Does that make sense? And not beat ourselves up too much, because we are addicts and we are going to make mistakes.
No, thank you so much. I think that was such an incredibly helpful description. I really appreciate that.
Hi, Jane. May I comment? This is Jim.
Yep. Please come in. This is Jim again.
And thank you, Scott, for the question. This is about sobriety versus bottom line, and my thought was that in the preamble, the SLA preamble, we touch on 5 major resources, and the first one is sobriety, which is our willingness to stop acting out in our own personal bottom line addictive behavior, it says, on a daily basis. And that also triggered a thought about, having gone through the steps and then doing a 10th step, which is a daily assessment. So here, with regard to sobriety, it's our willingness. It's like step 2, came to believe, and then I guess the key to that is a willingness to accept guidance from a power greater than ourselves. So since this is progress rather than perfection, then my bottom lines would include any opportunity to place myself in harm's way psychologically, physically, morally, or spiritually, and in protecting my sobriety by not subjecting myself to temptation or to any environment, person, place, or thing where there is an unreasonable trigger where I might be subject to breaking a bottom line. And then, therefore, I would substitute top lines, those areas that are strictly off limits to me and where my sobriety would be threatened. So sobriety and adherence to bottom line seem to work well together. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, so much. I really appreciate that. Who'd like to come in next? Things you could talk about is sobriety versus bottom lines, or what method you used to determine your bottom lines. Did those change over time? Or what method you used to determine sobriety? Or if you just even the cycle of addiction. I guess there's one thing I meant to say, too, is bottom lines, like there's that what starts me down that road where I can't get back. What takes me to what is that first drink for me? Because what my bottom lines are, in and of themselves, they won't sound that bad. But if I do that, then I'm off and running, and I'll end up somewhere I don't want to be. My bottom lines don't even really sound that bad, but if I do that, then things will end up bad. So that might be another way you want to define it. What starts me down the dark and ugly road where I have lost powerlessness? Anybody else want to come in and talk about bottom lines, sobriety? How do you determine your bottom lines?
Hey, this is Jody in Wisconsin.
Hey, Jody, come on in.
Hi. Thanks. Thanks for the shares. I spent a lot of time in my first months in SLAA working on defining bottom lines and working with the characteristics, which I think is really rich material, and it was important for me to see myself in the characteristics and to start to see the realities of my behaviors and how, as I peeled away the layers more and more subtly seeing like how seeing how subtly I was running those behaviors, oh my God, there too, and there too, and there too, and as I worked it, getting to see that was really important to me. What's also true for me is that in an attempt to work the steps and get sobriety, spending a lot of time doing that was a really huge problem for me. And ultimately what it led to was a really massive relapse during which I felt utterly hopeless and unable to be helped by the fellows, the recovery partners I had, and by my sponsor. And what finally helped me get to a solution that has stuck for me has been focusing instead on seeing, there was something you said a minute ago, what you said about what starts me down that road that I can't come back. That was what I wrote down about what you said, Jane. And so what I ended up doing was hooking up with a new sponsor, a different sponsor, who took me through the steps using the AA Big Book. And what that gave me was an awareness of how really the real root of my problems was, as it says in the book, selfishness, self-centeredness, that we think is the root of our troubles, driven by 100 forms of fear, self-delusion, self-seeking, and self-pity. We step on the toes of our fellows and they retaliate. And it took a little bit, but pretty quickly in the process of working the steps, I was able to start to see that, in fact, all of my acting out behaviors were really just symptoms, and that the real root was my disconnection from that higher power, which really means I was trying to run my life on self-will, on my ideas and trying to be in control of everything. So at the root of that is fear. And so my sponsor, who took me through the steps in a way that helped me actually get the solution and really live it forward, has helped me go straight to that source as the real thing that starts me down that road. So living in the recovered state, at the end, living in steps 10, 11, and 12 and sponsoring and living in that place, what that means, what that looks like for me is that on a daily basis, rather than looking at, what used to be my long, extensive list of bottom lines or midlines even, I held on to those for quite a while, but I don't even think about them anymore because they're not the issue. The real issue is way upstream from that, which is if I'm ever irritable, restless, or discontented, that's what's about to start the ball rolling. And so that's where I dwell now. And so when I'm taking sponsees through the steps, we talk about that very, very early on. And we start to look at if you're ever feeling irritable, restless, or discontented about anything whatsoever in life, that's the red flag, and that's where we start. And that's where we start to hook into our higher power. We do a quick 10-step. I take people through 10 steps pretty early in the steps, even when they're not technically on the 10th step yet. And we do an inventory. I know you do this as well, Jane. And do an inventory and help hand that over to our higher power and turn to service, turn our focus onto service. And in that process, that power from God, as we understand God, starts to flow in and shift us into a different place. And so what I've found for myself, and I'm seeing this with my sponsees as well, is that we don't actually end up focusing much at all on identifying what our acting out behaviors are, because they just kind of go away when we really stay focused on staying out of that self-centeredness and that fear place. And they're kind of obvious because we're pretty irritable, restless, and discontented when we start to act out. That said, I don't think it's always, I think over those times of like peeling away the layers, sometimes later on in this process, it can be helpful to be like, oh, yeah, wow, look at that thing that I do that I didn't realize before was acting out. But I sure do get irritable, restless, and discontented when I'm doing that thing. So maybe that too, and that's where I start to see it useful and start to see it peeling away those more subtle layers. So for me, trying to do that first thing up front only led to relapse and struggle and pain, and was not a way that helped me get to the solution. And I have struggled with feeling like how to help people who might be feeling stuck in that place of spending a lot of time analyzing, talking, and writing about the problem as opposed to just getting right into that solution, which is where we get to actually start to feel better. I'll pass. Thanks.
Thank you, Jody, so much. It's always great to hear you. I really appreciate what you share. Anybody else want to come in and share?
So, hey, Jane, Scott.
Hey, Scott.
So one of the things that kind of my experience, strength, and hope, we know that I'm in that great category of the, 50% of the people who hear the message get it, and they never drink or act out again. And then there's another 25% who get it, and they act out a few times before they get it all the way kind of squared up. And I am in that 25% category. And one of the things that my sponsor did for me was took me to the big book and told me the story of Jim. And Jim was a guy that had some recovery and things were going really well for him, but he kept relapsing. And it's really interesting because the story starts out and they give us actually the solution right at the very start of the story. And what the solution was, what for Jim was, and this is on page 35 of the big book, all went well for a time, but he failed to enlarge his spiritual life. And, one of the things that one of the fellows in SLAA that does a lot of work always says is, while I'm sober, my addict is in the background doing push-ups. And so, our addiction doesn't sit quietly. It's not, if my sobriety's getting stronger, my addiction is getting weaker. We have to continue to enlarge our spiritual life. We have to continue to turn things over to God, or else we'll find ourselves in trouble. And one of the explanations is why do we go back? And it says, but there's always a curious mental phenomenon that parallels with our sound reasoning. There's invariably ran some insanely trivial excuse for taking the first drink or first acting out. My best thinking is what that is. Why do I go back? My best thinking. And it was, at the end of the day, all of our sound reasoning. When we're trying to do this off of our reasoning and off of our willpower and off of whatever it is, swapping good behaviors out for bad behaviors out, none of that, all of that winds up not holding us in check. Because at the end of the day, the only way that I was able to stay sober was to turn more and more of my stuff over to God, to give Him my everything, and to put, to work on my spiritual malady as described in the book. All right, thanks.
Thank you so much, Scott. I really appreciate you sharing that. Would anyone else like to come in? It's a great discussion. Well, I guess I will say, that's one of the tricky things about a trauma-based addiction. A trauma-based addiction that is really a configuration of behaviors that create a chemical reaction in the brain. It's like we have, like that Monday night meeting. We have a whole meeting. This meeting meets every single week forever about what's the bottom line and what isn't. Alcoholics, they don't have meetings called "How do you know if you're drunk or not?" Okay, it in and of itself, determining intoxication and sobriety, and what is normal human behavior and what is behavior that is going to create a huge problem for us. It is a much more complicated question in a trauma-based addiction, but it it is, which is why everybody's talking about it, and I appreciate so much the description of the process, because it's not usually people give the identification of the disease, and there's a lot of that, and there's a lot of use for that. But what has been so wonderful about what everybody's shared is they're offering identification for the process itself. What it feels like, what it is like, the steps you take, what works, what doesn't work. And when in our basic text, in the withdrawal chapter, and I tell people this all the time in after meetings, you almost have to use the power of the steps to be able to even start the steps. Because this addiction is so overwhelming, the withdrawal is so painful. I've heard people say that, their withdrawal from heroin was easier than this. And, the basic underlying principle of a 12-step program is there's certain spiritual actions that will invite the power of God, as have been described, right? The 6 basic principles: complete deflation, which means stop trying to control an addiction. You won't be able to. Stop trying to control stuff. You won't be able to. The second one is inventory. The third one is confession, just basically reading the inventory you wrote. The next one is amends, trying to make up for harms done. Now, none of that seems like it has anything to do with sex or love, right? The purpose of the steps or alcohol, is to invite the power of God into our struggle so that he can do what we can't do. And then, of course, the last one is intensive work with other addicts/alcoholics, where we help them write inventories and we listen to the inventories they wrote, and we help them make amends, and then we help them help other people do that. That's the basis of all 12-step programs. And so when people come in, they're in so much pain. They're so distressed. They can't stop doing what they can't stop doing. That I do, as was mentioned, I almost have to, I go, well, why don't you write down 3 resentments? Why don't you write down 3 fears? And how do you feel now? I feel better. Because anytime, why don't you start being of service? Did you hurt anybody in the last 24 hours? Why don't you see if you can make up for that? Because we almost need to invite the power of God into this process that we're describing. You almost need to work the steps to be able to even determine what is an addictive, obsessive, compulsive pattern of behavior that we need to refrain from, and what is just the blob of pain and rage and despair that a lot of people walk in that door with. And that's why I hope, Jody, you'll come for our steps section, because that will describe the actions that will invite God. And I recommend people start those right off the bat. I think sometimes people come to the fellowship and they have one particular goal, and they get a lot of relief just from coming to meetings and talking about the problem. And they go, yeah, I'm doing okay, I don't need to work the steps. I'm like, this is a little pink cloud period, and if I were you, I would use this lovely relief time you have to, get a sponsor and start working on your 4th step, because otherwise this is what's going to happen. Insanity will return, and it always does. And then, not only do you have to do the steps, but you have to do the steps while you're in painful withdrawal. I highly recommend everybody take advantage of their lovely pink cloud period that God gives them to start their inventories. Hardly anybody takes me up on that, but it is my recommendation. And, in the withdrawal chapter, the guy who started our program, Rich, he said, there is cold turkey, and then there's people who slowly chip away at behaviors over time. And he said that neither one actually ends, they both will lead to a useful and long-standing sobriety, as long as immediately those 6 principles that I described are used. That even if someone's still acting out, hey, well, are you inventorying your acting out? Are you addressing your resentment and fear while you're doing that? Are you trying to not hurt people? Are you trying to be of service? And that he said, like in AA, there's no such thing as a little bit pregnant or a little bit drunk, but he says in SLA there is such a thing as a little bit sober. And if someone's willing to take a little bit of action, they get a little bit of relief, and then they use that relief, they take a little more action. And as was mentioned, that list of behaviors is no longer the focus. It is just gone. And I've seen that happen fairly consistently. But at the beginning, I think everybody comes in here because they want to be able to do something they couldn't do, and they want to stop doing something they can't stop doing. But appreciate so much everyone describing what that experience was like, because then otherwise people they have a lot of company for the disease, but they don't have company. Now they have company for the journey of applying that process. Would anyone else like to come in, be a fellow traveler on the journey? Want to be company for a newcomer? Well, hearing no, and this what happened last time, is I had Scott turn up the machine. I'm gonna have him not, and then people come in, and they said all this great stuff, So I'm gonna do a wrap up show, and then Scott can record it, and then he can edit it later if people don't want it on the recording. But this is what I asked last time. So was there anything there that you think would be more helpful for newcomers that maybe we didn't address, or just come in we're just, our goal is to carry his message and make it easy for people to get started in SLA. So we're basically just sort of recording the discussion in case someone says brilliant stuff like they did last time, and we want to end it putting it on the thing. Although what everyone said was just brilliant, it was just genius. So I thought it was wonderful. Does anybody have any ideas about how we can do this better, or what we should address more?
Hi, Jane, this is Jim.
Hey, Jim.
Hi. Yes, something that came to mind. I'm so enthralled with your presentation. It's great. And what Scott contributed is the notion of this being, again, I'll repeat, a trauma-based addiction. And something I was exposed to recently in a community, I guess a recovery community organization, which is, funded for, recovery and mental health treatment, was the idea that the organization, the environment, like our meetings, need to be trauma-informed. And that means noting that the folks, in our program and folk in recovery have been not necessarily, even the folks who have, chemical addictions need a safe place, an informed place, so that we don't further violate mistrust or prevent them from becoming vulnerable. My face-to-face meeting in Dallas is very much a very welcoming environment. It's very small, under 9 people, and I heard something last night, that adheres to the second sign of recovery, that we are willing to be vulnerable because the capacity to trust has been restored to us by our faith in a higher power. And there's other things in the signs of recovery too that says to me that our growth, our recovery, our sobriety it's important to be trauma informed. In other words, the environments, the people that we associate with, the places we go, and if we're to put ourselves at risk, especially physically, psychologically, spiritually, we need to avoid those situations because they're counter to our need for trusting, safe environments. So I want to learn more, and I've heard this phrase, trauma-informed, and I'll try to find more documentations on that, but that might be an area of interest or focus to help us to understand why we have traditions and why we strive so hard to help our fellows to feel comfortable and not to violate respect or trust. Thanks, Shane.
Wow, thank you so much, Jim. maybe you could be one of our speakers on that. And we could put that in our relationship section. It's going to include our traditions and our concepts of service. And I think that, wow, I'd love to have you do a talk on that. Because I think it's sometimes, say for a substance-based addiction, is this okay for me to, because you gave me an idea, it's like, AA Big Book is nice and clear, but they see emotional trauma as a quote-unquote outside issue. And whereas in fact, trauma is our addiction. It's what we are powerless over. That those sort of trauma-based behaviors, they're not defects of character. They are, in fact, our addiction. And that there's a difference between saying, is, okay, now you realize you were hurt, okay, now fix it. It's, no, we work our steps over that hurt, and we let God change it for us. And the gentleness of understanding that we're powerless over our trauma back then, and we're certainly powerless over it right now. I would love to have you be one of our speakers for that.
Well, thank you. I'm flattered, and I want to fortify my knowledge around trauma and being trauma trauma-based addiction and being trauma informed, and we'll keep in touch. We can do handshakes on this, Jane. Hopefully, I could be prepared to do that. Thank you for the suggestion.
No, that'd be great. Well, whenever you're ready, just tell Ryan, and then he'll tell Scott, and then we'd just love to have you do that. That'd be great, because kindness is a pretty important part of this process. Yes. Thanks so much. That's a great idea.
Yeah. It's I learned about this from I have one sponsee now in SLAA, and he has been very instrumental in teaching me a lot about recovery, and he knows a lot about this, so I will actually enlist him to help me to come prepared. Thank you.
Great. Both come. That's a great idea. Anybody else have any ideas about how we can maybe elaborate on our helpfulness? I'm afraid that I turned off the tape because last time then everybody said all this cool stuff, and I wish we'd recorded that. Anything else, Scott, you think we should add, or any direction that became apparent to you? Or?
Hey, Jane. So one thing I think for me that I think we always need to when we're talking to newcomers or old comers like me, us 25%ers. It's I'm proud of it. Proud to be in the Red Reading Group. Proud to be a 25%er. So for me, I think it's really, really important to remind all of us that we seek progress, not perfection, because this is such a crazy, crazy disease, and it doesn't fix easily. And it's hard for us because we've come here with a whole life work of trying to fix this on our own. And we've got this giant body of shame around us. And so when we fail, like when I failed, shame would just nearly consume me. And I was lucky enough to have some people that stood for me in recovery when I couldn't stand for myself, and would remind me that we seek progress, not perfection. What is it? Tradition. It's tradition 3, isn't it? That says the only requirement for membership is a desire to stop acting out. That's it. It's just a desire. We just have to be willing to stop acting out. It doesn't say we stop. We just have to be willing, because this takes a while. It's not something that we just we've woven this addiction into all the fabrics of our life. And if we think that this addiction is about sex, we probably need to think a little more, because what we really realize is that the sexual component is just the medicine. There's something that sits underneath that's relational, as you spoke about, and it's probably rooted in trauma. And it takes a while, and it takes a very safe environment to begin to do that work. And so just to remind people that this is a safe place to come and begin to trust God, and to begin to unpack our stuff. And, and God didn't expect perfection, and no one in this fellowship does. And so I think always that we remind people of progress and not perfection, because we can't be perfect. Okay, I think that's just another really, 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 for me, an important deal, because every time I reminded myself that I wasn't perfect, the shame of that would take me down so much so that I had to act out to hide the shame. It was crazy. This crazy spiral started. So, okay, that's the end of what I have to say about that.
No, thank you so much. I'm so glad you got that on there. That's such a good point. I think sometimes people even start to look at bottom lines. They feel so much shame, they just stop. So I'm really, really glad you shared that. Anyone else?
The other. Hey, so there's one other thing. That I think that in our bottom lines, one of the lies we tell ourselves is that we're the only ones that does this. And, when we find a fellowship that we can even say and talk about our addiction, we're very surprised that there are even others that are kind of like us. And I think it's really, really healthy to know that, so I have had, I've listened to a bunch of fifth steps now, where, a bunch of inventories, and no one's shocked me yet. There's nothing that's shocked me. There's nothing that's made me want to run from somebody, because it's me too. And so I just, as you, I think it was Jane that you said, our fears, we chase our fears to healing. So the stuff that scares us, we chase that right into, because that's what leads us into where we really need healing. So, all right, now I'm going to be quiet because I've said way too much. Thanks.
Well, I don't think you said way too much. I thought it was perfect. Thank you so much. That's wonderful. Anybody else? See what happens. We think we're over. Now we're getting to a lot of really good stuff. I guess in your mind, if you were brand new, and this is your second little speaker tape you were listening to, what would you wish someone had told you when you had just gotten here? Which is basically what we're doing, right? No, thank you, Scott. That was wonderful. Anybody else? Well, one thing that came up was Jim mentioned it, and I think you mentioned it too, the characteristics. So I think we can we can put a link to the characteristics in the bottom line sobriety section. What do you guys think? Because I think they're on the website. I just keep coming up with stuff for Ryan and Scott to do.
Yes, Jane. Jim here.
Hey, Jim.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, and you can find the characteristics and the signs of recovery on the SLAAFSW.org site under Resources tab, and scroll down to the right. Those might be great links. I found a lot of common threads, in your talk to those two documents.
Oh, yeah, I think that's a good idea. And then it's also, they're fairly loving, I think that's a good idea. Yeah, maybe we could, because like I said, we're going to have 5 sections, 5 little cubbies, getting started, like just how to survive those first few days or weeks or months. And then the second one we have right now is what is in fact sobriety, what's the bottom line, people don't even know what it is. And then the next section we're going to do spirituality, what about God. So I hope people will join us for that, because that's another big question. Do I have to believe in God? What if I don't like God? And then the steps, we already have some tapes on the steps, but if anyone wants to contribute to that. And then I know Judy does a lot of step work, so I'd love to have her weigh in on that. And then the relationships section. So if this might be helpful for the bottom lines, sobriety, just to get people familiar with the addiction without being really specific about behaviors. That's a great idea, Jim. Thanks for mentioning, and Scott, you mentioned that as well. So hey, if two out of 5 people mention it, that might mean it's a good way to have it be a link for that. Any other suggestions? All the things you want to tell a newcomer, but nobody asked. Okay, well, did I hear somebody?
Yeah, Jim here. I think this was mentioned. I'm probably overlapping Scott and you on progress, not perfection, because it's a topic that comes up in my face-to-face meetings that seem to help newcomers to open up and feel safe. So, and there is a pamphlet, I'm not sure how relevant it is, on the SLA site called Measuring Progress. It's a well-known pamphlet that has some key affirmations and points in there that I sometimes mention in terms of progress, not perfection, that I see newcomers really being drawn to, and sometimes people who've been in the program for a long time, the SLA or SLA-APP, don't know that particular pamphlet exists. So there may be something else that we can address that's listed there. It may be a list. I mean, the same content may exist in the basic text, but I just thought of that pamphlet that I use quite often.
Oh, thank you. That's such a great idea. It's like we have all this literature, but I think that finding it on the website or wading through everything else. So I think what we'll do is we'll just write down those, and then we can just put a link to the pamphlet and a link to the page. Because I wouldn't have thought of that. I've been around a long time, but I think that's a really lovely point that both you and Scott brought out, which is that just even starting to think about this makes people feel so bad that maybe as a part of this section, we need to include a lot of encouraging input, like progress, not perfection, or how do you measure progress when you can't. I wouldn't have thought of doing that, so we could have that be well, you guys did. It provided, okay, so this is how you come up with the inventory for it, but we're going to need a lot of encouragement. So I think that would be really good to put it there into, like having encouraging literature be a part of the second section. Is that kind of what you guys meant?
I think so. I think a lot was said tonight. I wasn't taking, notes on my computer, but I heard just so much good content that I could probably go back to the recording and listen for. And the mentioning of, the steps and what you said very succinctly about what's needed before we really get into the steps. Newcomers sometimes wondering if you've got to, go through it step by step, order by order, and not even touch on certain principles until you get to that step. And then we emphasize in How It Works, Chapter 5, that the steps or just they're suggested as a way to recover, or for steps are suggested as a program of recovery. So we could weave those ideas, that are important for newcomers, and there may be more into our presentations. I think we'd probably get some interesting responses for people who really may be otherwise turned off by a meeting format or the thought that it's an impossible task to work the steps. I think it's more important that they understand the steps and not feel taken back by them. And I've had sponsors who really impressed me greatly about how we did it. And just wanted to say that. Thanks.
No, thank you. I really, really appreciate that. The value of this is we can do whatever we want. So if you say, you know what, this is what I really wish, and just all you have to do is call Scott and say, hey, and we can record anything we want, see, on this line. So if anyone here says, I really wish I'd said that, all you have to do is call Scott, and he'll just add it on the end of it, or we can put it in any other section we want. So that's the point of it, is to get people thinking about what they would like newcomers to know, and anything anybody thinks they should know, we have a section to put it in. We have a way to record it, and it would certainly be wildly welcome. Thank you so much. Something about the way you said that I thought would be really helpful to newcomers. Like you said, I think people are scared about the steps, and yet they need the relief of the steps to even start thinking about bottom lines and sobriety. I think it is kind of unusual. It's different than a lot of other fellowships. So thank you. I'm glad you brought that up.
Hey, James Scott.
Hey, Scott.
I think for me, and Jody touched on this, and I greatly appreciated her touching on this. But you're saying, well, what do we need to tell people that are brand new coming here? And I think that what we really need to help them understand is their problem is not a sexual addiction or however, their problem is not sex and love addiction. Their problem is that they have a lack of power, and that's what our program is all about, is helping them find a power. And that power is God, however you choose to define God. And that's how this gets fixed. And, we express that power problem through our acting out, through our addiction. But the real problem is, that we have described as a spiritual malady. And then I want to say that in the AA Big Book, there's kind of a definition of what spiritual life is, or a spiritual awakening, or what we're talking about. And what it wants to make sure is that we're not defining who God is. We're not defining who higher power is for anybody. But we're just defining that you need to have a higher power a power greater than yourself. And I think I really love the way it talks about in that definition of defining our spiritual experience. One of my favorite things that it talks about is that our recovery is more of an educational variety. It's not overwhelming overnight. I mean, there are some people that do have those experiences, but most is more of an educational variety, and that just means that it develops slowly over a period of time. And then what it says is, this is remarkable. Quite often, friends of the newcomer are aware of the differences in you long before you are yourself. And so our friends and the people around us help us realize that we're undergoing these profound alterations in the way that we react to life before we even understand what's going on around us. And so I think that's really important too, is sometimes you think, man, I'm still right where I'm at. I'm stuck in the mud. And your friends go, no, look at the difference. Look at you. I know you. Let me remind you. Let me tell you. Let me reflect this back to you. And so again, and I think that speaks to this deal of gaining recovery buddies or fellow travelers. Sky from Florida always talks about getting her arsenal, and we have people that we can call and we can talk to. And having our sponsor, that can remind us of where we're at and what's going on, and look how far we've changed, because we have moments where we need to be reminded of, look what's happening, because our recovery sometimes are educational, and we just don't see that progress. But everybody else around us can, but we're our worst critics because we expect perfection instead of progress. Okay. That's all.
No, thank you so much. Well, everybody keeps saying things that I think would be so helpful. I never would have thought of any of them, but then what's coming clear to me is, like I said, I have 12 and a half years. It's at that beginning part, how much encouragement and how it's hard to see progress. And it's true, if you that the sobriety and recovery can be developing even if people keep are having trouble with their bottom lines, and that's a separate thing to measure. How many people you have in recovery, how many meetings you go to, how much service you're in, how much people see you change. It's almost like I do believe in people. People say, "Well, I hardly ever focus." I never. People come in and they go, "Should I do this or that?" I go, I never focus on what people should or shouldn't do in terms of acting out or bottom lines, because if they could stop, they would. I tend to focus on how to get some power. And it is almost true that sometimes you have to focus more on recovery and sobriety and wait for God to relieve the obsession and the compulsion and the behavior. And that how hard that is at the beginning, how hard that is to see that as progress. And did we run out of time?
Nope, sorry about that. I'm not muted. That was my phone. Sorry, Jim.
Oh, it's okay. Well, it's possible I should. So I hope that's okay. It's like I'm listening to everybody, and what I'm listening to is the trend to offer encouragement for this process, and to offering love for the difficulty of it. Have people come in and they're after meetings and they broke a bottom line and they feel so ashamed and they're crying and they go, how did this happen? And I go, do I sound surprised to you? And they go, no. And I go, because I understand powerlessness. That addicts are supposed to act out. That's what they're supposed to do. The relief from acting out can only be attained through the grace of God. So if you want, I'll help you do an inventory and maybe get some more grace right now. But if people could stop acting out, quote unquote, because I told them not to, I would be the richest woman in the world. So I never focus on that when I'm offering, when people come and I say, you want to get some power, you want to get some relief right now, I'd be happy to give you some ideas about how to do that. And I will offer you comfort and understanding about the shame and despair that once again to realize or to truly accept maybe for the first time that this is an addiction. And these listed behaviors, we are in fact powerless. Only God can remove them. So what I got from most of what people said is to focus on inviting the power of God through the steps and offering just unconditional love and acceptance with the timing and the process and how that plays out. Did I understand the sort of trend of what people wanted to offer?
I think so.
Okay, and if anybody,
Yep.
I know we're sort of, I'm sorry, what? We're sort of coming to the end of it. Scott, does anybody else want to come in? And then I'm hoping everybody will come the next time. We're going to talk about spirituality and the whole God thing. So sounds like a lot of people have to say about that. So I hope you show up for that. Did anybody else want to say anything before Scott turns off the recording? Well, Scott,
Okay.
you want to